You thought it would be easy. Teach them to chart their menstrual cycles, they said. Help them learn to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, they said. And then you saw the charts. You saw things that you didn't even know were possible, and you really don't know how to interpret them. Fortunately, I've created the perfect solution for you. I want to share with you our top resource for women's health professionals, how to interpret virtually any chart your client throws at you. This new resource breaks down complex chart interpretation into an easy step-by-step process. It will give you the tools you need to better support your clients. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/chart to snag your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/chart. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 551. All right, today I'm sharing a brand new episode in my FAMM research series. I was actually having a random conversation with my husband, and he asked a really interesting question. So we're of West Indian background, and I think somehow in the topic of conversation, just our like regular topic of conversation, we were talking about marijuana and the negative impact that it has on sperm quality. And he asked, he's like, well, there's this whole idea that Rastas, so that's a whole thing, but, Caribbean men who follow that religious belief tend to smoke more marijuana. So he's like, oh, there's this belief that they just have such high fertility. What's the story on that? And I mentioned there's this study that I cited in Real Food for Fertility that specifically looked at marijuana use among Jamaican men. And he was like, oh, that's so interesting. And I said, you know what? I should probably do a FAMM research series on that because I think it would be really interesting information. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to dive into this today. And I think by the end of it, you might have more clarification on how it impacts fertility, this marijuana. And for those of you who are kind of familiar with that background story of that, Rasta men having high fertility, it might shed some light on why marijuana use affects some men differently than others. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump in. So the name of the study is Marijuana Use and its Influence on Sperm Morphology and Motility. And the subtitle, Identified Risk for Fertility Among Jamaican Men. And so if you're wanting more details on the study itself, feel free to head over to the show notes page, fertilityfriday.com/551. And we'll have the links there if you're wanting to grab the abstract and kind of see the details on that. So let's talk a little bit about the study background. So interestingly, this is the very first study that is looking specifically at the impact of smoking marijuana on the sperm quality of Caribbean men in particular. So that makes it, I suppose, an interesting. That's one of the reasons why we're talking about it, because it is interesting that they focus specifically on this population, given some of the, stereotypes that we might be aware of. So, just to put it all into perspective, I've talked about sperm quality a ton over the years. I've written about it in my books. I wrote extensively about it in Real Food for Fertility. Chapter 9, sperm quality, is just a monster chapter. It's very welcoming in that the writing is in such a way that we've condensed a ton of, highly scientific information into a very palatable, easy to read chapter, but it's jam-packed with information. So certainly if you are wanting to learn more, if this episode piques your interest, then you'll certainly want to have a deeper dive into that. So the background in general is that many of us have heard the statistics here or there or mentioned in the media that there's been a worldwide decline of sperm quality over the past 70 years. So I highlighted this also in my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign, where if you just look at research, if you just pull studies from the 40s that were looking at sperm criteria in one way or another and look at the sperm quality of these men, you'll find that the average man in the 40s had significantly higher sperm numbers than the average man today. So to put it into perspective, the average man in the 40s, when you're looking at these studies, anywhere upwards of 100, 110, 115 million sperm per milliliter was just the average. That wasn't even like the top or anything like that. That was just the average. And today, if you look at the studies, the average is falling closer to like 50 million sperm per milliliter. And again, the range is still pretty big. But that tells us that there's something going on. And so one of the reasons that the researchers chose this study, based on what they were saying in the study itself, is that, with this decline and the fact that we're knowing it, the fact that we're seeing it in the statistics consistently, there's a lot of questions as to what is causing it. So obviously this is multifactorial. There's a variety of factors that are contributing, from diet quality to health status. Some of the factors that we spoke about, Lily and I, in Real Food for Fertility, particularly in the sperm chapter, include metabolic issues and a variety of other health factors that can play a role in sperm quality. But obviously the use of recreational drugs, the use of alcohol, cigarettes, these all potentially play a role. So that would be one of the reasons that they focused on this in particular. Another few interesting facts from the study itself that kind of led the researchers to kind of, focus on this is that, they reported that in Jamaica, up to 30% of the population have used marijuana. And it says that the most recent National Health and Lifestyle Survey revealed that 17%, of Jamaicans are current users, with the majority being young males. So in particular, they found that, of the general population, the males who are in that reproductive age tend to be regular users, or a higher percentage of them tend to be regular users. So they're wanting to know, okay, so if this much of the population is using marijuana, then how is it actually affecting fertility in particular? So let's talk about how they designed the study so that we can have an idea of, what was going on. And so basically they were specifically looking at couples, so men from couples who were seeking fertility assistance. So I think that's useful to consider. This is something I've always talked about and certainly thought about quite a bit in my practice working with clients, because if I'm working with fertility clients in particular, they're typically individuals who have been trying to conceive unsuccessfully. So you're looking at a subpopulation in that general population. And that's something that the researchers talk about later on as they get to the conclusions of their study, where they're saying, we were looking at this population who were seeking fertility support. And if you think about it from a practical standpoint, if you're trying to gather data like this, it's going to be easier to gather data from people who were seeking assistance anyway. So that's how they designed their study, where couples who were already seeking assistance for fertility, they enrolled them, gave them the option to enroll in the study. And from there, they created a specific questionnaire where they assessed the frequency and quantity of their marijuana use. So there were 229 participants in the study who, provided their data, and that's what the study is based on. So, not the biggest sample size, but I always find that you can still, it doesn't mean you have to generalize it over everybody, but you can always gain some insights even from some of these smaller studies. So a few of the things that they were looking at specifically include, their history. Like if they've used it before, they defined a person as a kind of ever user, like in the research language, but someone who'd used it as someone who reports using it in the previous 5 years. And so if they hadn't used it within the past 5 years, then they were considered a non-user. They looked at the recent use, they looked at the frequency, they looked at the quantity. And so that kind of lends itself to some interesting results, which we'll get to. They also looked at some of the other factors, so lifestyle factors. As in all research studies, they want to adjust the results and not be skewed. So if somebody who uses marijuana also smokes cigarettes, they want to make sure that they're kind of isolating the effect of marijuana in particular. So they did test for a variety of other factors that could potentially play a role so that they could have more accurate results. And again, this is pretty typical when they're looking at research studies. And something to mention as well is, of course, they relied on the 2010 WHO, World Health Organization guidelines to determine what is normal. So their bar of what is normal versus abnormal is in line with the bar of what you yourself, if your partner has had his sperm analyzed based on the same kind of bar that they would be using in the lab. And if you're working with clients, the same type of bar that your clients would be using as well to define what is normal versus abnormal. So normal motility, just in line with the 2010 guidelines, they defined as greater than or equal to 40%. So 40% of the sperm being motile. And in terms of the actual, count, they're looking at about 20 million sperm per milliliter or higher would be identified as normal. And then morphology, if you have a sperm sample with 4% or greater normal morphology, that is considered to be normal. And anything below those numbers would be considered to be abnormal. So that's a little bit about the background history of the study so that you get a sense of who was in there and what they were studying, what they were looking at. So let's go ahead and then get into some of the results of the study. So interestingly, in this study, the vast majority of participants were under 40, which I guess isn't surprising because that's within that kind of reproductive age range. So they said 70% were 40 years or younger, and then the ages ranged from age 23 and age 72. And again, these were couples who were seeking fertility support. So just about half of the users reported that they did use marijuana at all. So it was 47%, so right around that, and 21% reported using it recently. So just as some general information there. So I think the most interesting results of the study were that the factors that were most highly correlated with abnormal morphology wasn't necessarily the frequency or recency of use. It was specifically the quantity. So what they found was that users of large quantities of marijuana were at a significantly higher risk of having abnormal sperm motility. So anywhere from like 2.5 to 4 times more likely. And moderate quantity users were over 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with abnormal morphology. So interestingly, it wasn't necessarily the frequency. There were a lot of men that reported themselves as regular users. I mean, what does that even mean? It could mean that they smoke just regularly, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're heavy smokers, for example. But it was really, so there wasn't as strong of an association with regular users in terms of the motility and the morphology specifically. But the quantity of use, the heavier users and the moderate users, was associated with a negative impact on the motility and the morphology. And another interesting finding from the study was that recent users were 40% more likely to have abnormal sperm motility. So the researchers kind of went into some of the speculations around why that could be. And one of the things that they said was that, we all have this endocannabinoid system that is receptive to the, cannabinoids in the marijuana, and the sperm have been reported to have receptors as well. So that was one of their possible explanations for why the recent use specifically was related to an increased risk of abnormal motility. Popping into today's episode with a quick question. Do you like paper charting? Today's episode is brought to you by the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook. This is the first beautifully designed, fully customizable paper charting workbook designed with you in mind. With 3 years worth of charting pages, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook has you covered. If you've been looking for a solid alternative to charting apps, you'll love this charting workbook. The FAMM Charting Workbook is available in both Fahrenheit and Celsius editions and is available in spiral-bound, paperback, and ebook versions. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/workbook to order your copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/workbook. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. So what does all of this mean? So I thought this was interesting, again, going back to the conversation I was having with my husband, because what that means is that, men who they're regular kind of casual smokers, but they don't necessarily smoke a lot. They don't necessarily smoke multiple times a day, every single day. Maybe they smoke a few times a week and it's like a small amount. The research didn't find there to be a significant negative risk associated with the regularity or frequency specifically. But when it came to the quantity, how much you're doing it, there was an association. And this isn't necessarily surprising. There's a number of research studies that have shown similar results. I've reported on many of them in my writings, my work. And it's a pretty common piece of knowledge and information that marijuana smoking and cigarette smoking is not good for sperm. And I think it was interesting how these researchers kind of broke it down, because it did give some explanation into that backstory that I shared, where there's this kind of like, oh, these Rasta men tend to have like such high fertility and et cetera. How could that be if they are known to be heavier users of marijuana? And it could be that the frequency plays a role. There was another piece of information that the researchers highlighted, which is that, the men who had other negative factors for fertility. So potentially if they had been trying to conceive for a long time, or they had other risk factors for fertility issues, those men seem to be more heavily impacted by the marijuana use in particular. So what that means, to say it a different way, is that men who were already at risk or already susceptible to fertility challenges, it was like potentially the marijuana use like just made it worse. So it just didn't help. If they already were struggling, the marijuana just really doesn't help at all. And that could speak to just maybe they have a lesser degree of resiliency or a greater susceptibility. But either way, that was an interesting finding. So, what this means in the practical sense, I think for you, if you personally are trying to conceive and you tuned into today's episode because you wanted to learn more about how sperm might be affecting your personal journey, or how marijuana might be affecting your personal journey, if your partner or yourself partake in marijuana use, it does mean, I think, to be cautious. If you already are struggling with fertility challenges, if you've been trying for a while with limited success and marijuana is a factor, I think it does mean that based on what the research is saying, the best thing moving forward would potentially be to reduce your use or eliminate it altogether if that's possible. And I think from the practitioner perspective, it is something to be aware of, something to be asking about, certainly something that should not be slipping through the cracks. There should be conversation around some of these factors. And a few things, because I can picture some questions being asked of, well, what about edibles? And what about this? And what about that? So this particular study didn't look at edibles. In Real Food for Fertility, there were different studies that did look at potentially the effect of THC in particular, so not limiting it to smoking. And there is some suggestion that the active ingredient, the THC, does play a role specifically in sperm quality. So even if you're not smoking it, but you're ingesting it, it potentially could have a negative effect. So I don't know that there's as much research specifically on edibles. But again, if you're falling into that reproductive category where you're already struggling, I think there is enough general information to say that that wouldn't help. So one thing we can know for sure is that it doesn't appear that marijuana is like a health food or a supplement that is going to benefit sperm quality overall. That's not something that we're seeing anywhere. So really this information just helps to inform your use. How are you going to approach this topic? How much are you going to use? And how would knowledge and information like this affect your behavior? And from a practitioner, how would this impact how you talk to your clients about this, and what you recommend, what kind of recommendations that you make? This is in line with the recommendations that the researchers made. They concluded by saying that we recommend that men being treated for infertility be routinely asked about the practice of smoking marijuana, and in particular, recent and heavy users counseled to stop. So a couple other interesting things. The researchers did mention the trends. One of the factors that was kind of playing a role in their decision to study this was that recent changes to legislation in Jamaica had loosened it a little bit, so that if you were found to have a small amount of marijuana on your person, it wasn't like an automatic jail sentence. And measures like this have been taken in a variety of different countries. I'm not sure about all the American states, but certainly in Canada, that has been a recent change. And it's a very significant change. In Canada now, there are pot shops everywhere, every corner, similar to when I was growing up and there were liquor stores on every corner. Now there are pot shops on every corner, and people smoke openly. You smell it when you're walking around and stuff like that. Whereas before, it was not as out in the open. So one of the comments that the researchers made about this was, now that it's more open, more visible, more people are doing it, it's more socially acceptable, the consequences have been certainly reduced. This means that use potentially is going to significantly increase. And what impact could this have, especially because it is the men that they're looking at the men. They're not necessarily looking at the women. I would argue that it also has a negative impact on egg quality. And so we could be asking about female users as well. But this particular study was looking at male use on sperm quality. But in terms of the kind of increased frequency, increased social acceptability of this, then how could this be impacting our population? This is certainly something that I have thought about as it becomes more mainstream and as more people are doing it. And it used to be illegal. So there was kind of like this mental, like it's not legal. And, I'm not sure that necessarily stops people from using it, but certainly makes it feel less socially acceptable. Whereas now it certainly seems like it's more socially acceptable because it is legal and you can buy it anywhere and all that kind of stuff, at least where I live. So I've certainly had my concerns, given that sperm quality is already declining before these changes in legislation. And one of the questions that I have, or concerns depending on how you frame it, is do young people really know the negative impact that marijuana smoking or consuming marijuana products could have on their fertility? Is this something that anyone is talking about in that age range? I think a lot of people in my age range, in the 30 to 40 year age range, maybe because you're, especially for couples who are trying to conceive, maybe there's more awareness because of that. But I really have to wonder if this is something that the younger generation has been exposed to, information that they've been taught. Because one of the things that we've talked about on this show for so long is that we're not taught much about our fertility at all. And many of us don't learn anything about our reproductive capacity, our menstrual cycle, fertility awareness charting, how to time sex correctly for conception, let alone the impact of a variety of different factors on our fertility, from birth control to diet, nutrition, to things like marijuana, cigarette smoking, or alcohol. So certainly that is one of the questions I have, is if young people actually are aware that this could have a negative impact on their fertility. So with that said, I think I'm going to wrap this right here. I'd be really curious how you think about what you think about today's episode. Feel free to find me on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Fertility Friday. When this episode comes out, I'll be posting a little bit on there. So feel free to jump in and share your thoughts on this topic. I suppose one last thing that I can jump in and say before we officially wrap today's episode is that I have seen in working with clients over the years that it does make a difference when your clients are able to make these types of changes. So to end on a note of hope, I suppose, it is actually beneficial, useful, and it does make an impact when you have a client who's like a heavier user of marijuana and they find a way to significantly reduce or eliminate the use of these products. Over time, it's not instant, certainly, but over the course of 4 to 6 months of consistent, not using it, plus adding specific nutrients, supplements that support the, antioxidants and reduce sperm DNA damage and all the different things, again, that we talk about in the sperm chapter of Real Food for Fertility, I have seen it make a really significant difference. And one of the great things about sperm quality is it's one of the things that we can measure. I mean, with women, in terms of egg quality, we can't give an egg sample, if you will, in the same way that men can give a sperm sample. And so you can actually do the test and see where you're starting from, make the changes, and then see what has changed and improved within 4 to 6 months. And sometimes it's really significant, and it can be a really good motivation, especially if you've been trying for a while and you need some good news. You need some hope and some motivation. And there's so much out of our control. So I like to focus on the things that are within our control. And I suppose marijuana use is typically one of those things that we can have some control over. So with that said, I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. If you've been enjoying the FAMM research series episodes, you can find a whole list over at fertilityfriday.com/research. I released this series a couple of years ago, and we have a significant number of episodes in here. So I know a lot of you really appreciate the deep dive into these research studies. And of course, it's always interesting to see what recent and maybe sometimes less recent research is looking at in terms of these topics that we cover on the podcast. So fertilityfriday.com/research. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. And that's a wrap. If you're loving the Fertility Friday podcast, then I know you'll love FAMM, our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Certification Program. It's a 9-month program designed to teach you how to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. The menstrual cycle is the missing piece you've been looking for to better support your clients to balance hormones, normalize their cycles, and optimize their fertility. When you join FAMM, I pull back the curtain and share advanced chart interpretation strategies and specialized client protocols that will completely transform your practice. Enrollment for FAMM is opening up again in a few months. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive to join the waiting list and be the first to know when early bird registration opens. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive.